Helen, how could you betray your own blood? I'm your mother. You stopped being my mother the moment you forged my name on a $2 million debt, Mom. The tracker I found was just the beginning. I know about the secret insurance policy. I know you were waiting for me to die for a payout. You have no proof. I have the metadata, the recordings, and the FBI on speed dial. The only thing I don't have anymore is a daughter's blind loyalty. That confrontation keeps replaying in my mind like a jagged, broken record. A toxic echo of a life I've finally outgrown. To clear the static and find my center, I sought the only sanctuary I had left. The cold metal and the honest silence of my own garage. This morning, a thick fog obscured the path to the house. A heavy gray curtain that seemed perfectly suited to the atmosphere of Alexandria. I slipped on my grease-stained work gloves, the familiar, stiff leather clinging to my palms. There's a special kind of peace found in the world of machines. A world where everything either works or doesn't. Where a screw is either tightened or loosened, and where the laws of physics never fail. My father taught me that. He often said that a woman who can maintain her own machinery will never have to rely on the kindness of strangers. He was preparing me for a world where those strangers would be the very people sitting at the same table with me. I slid the creeper under the chassis, the cold dampness of the concrete seeping through my coveralls. This SUV was more than just transportation. It was my sanctuary, the only space my mother, Aileen, couldn't quite reach with her floral arrangements and passive-aggressive suggestions about my unfeminine hobbies. At 28, working as a legal analyst in the heart of DC, I should have felt autonomous. Yet, every time I stepped into the family estate, I felt that invisible weight, the maternal expectation that I should be a polished accessory to her social standing rather than a woman who understood the intricacies of a legal brief or a fuel line. Helen, dear, don't stay out in the damp too long. Aileen's voice had drifted from the porch last night, honeyed and thick with that performative concern she wore like a designer scarf. You know how your chest gets tight in the autumn? It sounded like love. It always sounded like love. But as I lay there in the silence of the garage, looking up at the skeletal frame of the vehicle, I remembered the way her eyes never quite matched her smile. A predator's gaze disguised by a mother's squint. I've lived my life by a simple philosophy. Character is built in the silence of one's actions, not the volume of their claims. My mother's claims were deafening, but her silence was where the secrets lived. My wrench slipped, clattering against the frame with a sharp, echoing ring. I reached up to steady myself, my fingers brushing against the smooth, cold surface of the inner frame rail, just behind the rear wheel well. My pulse didn't jump immediately. It stuttered. There was something there that didn't belong to the factory assembly. It was a small, rectangular box, held fast by an industrial-grade magnet. I felt the familiar heat of a battery pack. It was still warm. I didn't scramble out. I didn't gasp. I simply lay there, my breath hitching in my throat, the scent of motor oil suddenly feeling like ash in my mouth. Have you ever placed your absolute trust in the one person who gave you life, only to realize they were the one holding the leash? I took a steadying breath, the professional legal analyst in me taking over. I pulled the device free with a sickening metallic click that sounded to my ears like a gavel hitting a block. It was a high-grade GPS tracker, the kind we see in surveillance cases. But this one had a secondary modification, a pinhole microphone and a cellular uplink. It wasn't just recording where I went. It was broadcasting everything I said, every private thought I'd muttered to myself, every confidential legal strategy I'd discussed on the phone, every tear I'd shed in the supposed privacy of my own car. It had all been fed directly to her. Trust is a fragile thing, like a vintage glass. Once it's shattered, the shards are too small to ever put back together, and they only serve to cut the person trying to fix it. I sat on the cold concrete floor, the tracker resting in my palm like a lead weight. The red LED blinked with a rhythmic, mocking consistency. I thought of the times I'd called my father, Hollis, from this very seat, complaining about Aileen's overbearing nature, or the times I'd discussed my suspicions about the charity's ledger. She had heard it all. She had been a ghost in my passenger seat, a silent judge in my private life. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, not of anger, but of a profound, chilling clarity. Looking back, I didn't need to be told I was being watched. I had felt the eyes on me for years. I just didn't want to believe they belonged to the woman who tucked me in. The urge to storm into the kitchen and throw this plastic betrayal onto the breakfast table was a physical ache in my throat. But I stayed seated. I've learned that when you find a trap, the last thing you should do is let the trapper know you've seen it. If I confronted her now, she would weep, she would gaslight, she would play the victim, and the tracker would simply be replaced by something more discreet. Mercy isn't about ignoring a crime. It's about refusing to let the criminal's darkness dictate the light you carry. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of my rage. I carefully wiped my fingerprints off the device with a shop rag and clicked it back onto the frame. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were handling a live explosive. I went to the workbench and pulled out a small notepad. I wrote a mundane note in my neatest script. Mom, headed to the hardware store for some filters. We'll be back for lunch. Love, Helen. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. I was maintaining the facade, not out of fear, but out of a tactical necessity to gain the upper hand. I climbed into the driver's seat, the leather upholstery suddenly feeling like a cage. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were steady, my face a mask of professional indifference. I realized then that my life as the sweet youngest daughter had ended the moment that metallic click echoed in the garage. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a witness. And in the eyes of the law, a witness who knows the truth is the most dangerous person in the room. I turned the key and the engine roared to life, a vibration that felt like a challenge. I knew that every word I spoke from this moment on, every turn I made, was a move in a high-stakes game. My mother was listening. She was waiting for me to falter, to prove that I was as weak as she constantly insisted I was. But as I backed out of the driveway, disappearing into the Virginia fog, I felt a quiet power rising within me. She wanted to know where I was going? Fine. I would lead her exactly where I needed her to be. The morning light filtered through the blinds of my Arlington studio, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor that looked like the bars of a cage. I didn't return to the estate. I couldn't. Instead, I drove to my office at the law firm in the heart of D.C., the city still groggy and blanketed in a thin, restless mist. My jaw was set so tight it ached, a physical manifestation of a bridge being dismantled, one stone at a time. I was no longer just a daughter or an analyst. I was a forensic investigator of my own life. I stepped into the sterile, glass-walled office, the hum of the air conditioning providing a cold, rhythmic comfort. I fired up my terminal, bypassing the standard administrative logs to access the high-security legal databases I used for corporate litigation. My fingers danced across the keys with a surgical precision, initiating a deep shadow audit on my social security number and financial history. I wasn't looking for mistakes. I was looking for the architect of my own ruin. The quietest people often possess the most relentless minds when the truth is at stake. As the data began to populate the screen, my stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. A dozen credit lines had been opened in my name over the last 18 months, each one maxed out and funneled through a series of offshore LLCs. The IP addresses for the digital signatures weren't from a hacker in a distant country. They were localized. Every single transaction originated from the private Wi-Fi network at Bright Future, my mother Aileen's prestigious charity headquarters. I leaned back in my chair, the glare of the monitors reflecting in my eyes like a cold digital fire. My own mother hadn't just been eavesdropping on my life. She had been cannibalizing it. She had taken my credit, my reputation, and my future to patch the holes in her failing social empire. I felt a surge of cold fury, the kind that doesn't scream but instead settles into your marrow like ice. It's a bitter realization when you discover that your silence wasn't a sign of weakness, but a gathering of strength for the storm you didn't know was coming. "Helen, you're in early," my senior partner remarked as he passed my door, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. I offered a professional, empty smile, the kind Aileen had taught me to use to hide the truth. I told him I was just finishing up some personal filings. It wasn't a lie. I was filing away the last remnants of my filial loyalty. I pulled up a specific file, a hard money loan agreement for a staggering $2 million. My breath hitched as I scrolled to the signature page. There it was. My name, written in a perfect flowing script that looked exactly like my own. But as I zoomed in on the high-resolution scan, I saw the tiny, microscopic tremors in the loops of the letters. It was a digital forgery, executed with a stylus and a tablet. I checked the metadata on the original PDF. The document had been signed on a Tuesday evening last September, precisely when I was at the estate for dinner. It was the same night Aileen had offered to fix my old laptop because it was running slow. She hadn't been helping me. She had been harvesting my digital signature while I was upstairs laughing at Kale's jokes. Under Virginia law, these documents made me legally and financially liable for a debt that was currently being used to launder money for a failing charity. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She hadn't just stolen my money, she had stolen my name to shield herself from federal scrutiny. Blood might be thicker than water, but transparency is the only thing that keeps a soul from drowning in a family like mine. I stared at that forged signature until the lines blurred, seeing not ink, but the absolute greed that had overridden every maternal instinct she ever pretended to possess. I began to compile a formal legal folder, each document a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the woman who called herself my mother. This wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. To hold someone accountable is the highest form of respect you can show to the truth, even when it hurts. I moved with a cold, methodical grace, preparing a civil summons for identity theft and a formal notification for the Office of the Attorney General. If she wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life, she was about to learn that I was the one who knew the rules. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Kale. Family dinner tonight at 7. Mom's making her famous pot roast. Don't be late, little sister. I looked at the message, a hollow laugh escaping my lips. The pot roast was likely just another stage for her next manipulation. I typed back a short, polite confirmation. I wouldn't let my voice or my words betray my discovery. True maturity is when you have the power to destroy someone who has systematically betrayed you, but you choose to let the law do the heavy lifting instead. I sat there for a long moment, the hum of the office now feeling like the countdown to a launch. I thought about the little girl who used to seek Aileen's approval for every grade, every outfit, every decision. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that peace is a commodity you have to fight for. Sometimes, walking away isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to burn the bridge while you're still standing on it to make sure nobody follows you across. I hit the print command on the final document, the rhythmic whir of the machine sounding like a drum roll in the quiet room. This folder would effectively end Aileen's reign as the queen of Alexandria society. It would strip her of her mask and reveal the predator beneath the pearls. But before I delivered the killing blow to her reputation, I needed to know if there was anything left to save of my father. I needed to find Hollis and see if a single shard of a conscience still existed in that house. As the printer tray filled with the evidence of a lifetime of betrayal, I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. I was no longer the youngest daughter waiting for permission to exist. I was the architect of my own escape. I gathered the papers, feeling the weight of the $2 million lie finally being transferred from my shoulders onto the legal record. I wasn't just clearing my name, I was reclaiming my soul from the people who thought they owned it. The road back to Alexandria felt like a descent into a past I no longer recognized. I gripped the steering wheel, the legal folder on the passenger seat acting as a silent, heavy witness to the betrayal I now carried. As I turned onto the long, oak-lined driveway of the Morrison estate, the grand colonial mansion loomed through the Virginia mist, its white pillars standing like bleached ribs. On the surface, the lawn was manicured to a razor's edge, but I knew now that the soil beneath was soaked in the rot of my family's reputation. I've often wondered if the people we love are ever truly who we think they are, or if we just build statues of them in our minds until the stone starts to crumble. My father, Hollis, had been the architect of my world, a man of blueprints and structural integrity. Now, as I parked the car, the silence of the estate felt suffocating, more like a mausoleum of secrets than a home. I didn't use the front door. I didn't want the staff or Kale to see the fire in my eyes. I slipped through the side entrance, moving toward the library, where I knew the ghost of my father would be lingering. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and expensive wax, scents that used to mean safety, but now signaled the sterile stage management of Aileen's life. I moved quietly, my heels muffled by the thick Persian rugs. The most dangerous prisons aren't built of iron bars or high walls. They are constructed from caring words and soft pillows that hide a slow-acting poison. My mother had mastered the art of the gilded cage, and I was about to find out exactly how deep the bars went. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the smell of old paper and the faint, sweet scent of the herbal tea Aileen insisted my father drink every evening. Hollis was sitting in his leather wingback chair, staring at a blueprint spread across his lap. His hands were stationary, a tragic contrast to the man who used to sketch skyscrapers with a hand that never wavered. He didn't even look up when I entered. He was lost in a persistent, hazy stupor that made my heart ache with a protective fury. "Dad?" I whispered, kneeling beside his chair. I took his hand. It was cold and felt as fragile as parchment. "Helen, is that you?" His voice was thin, a mere shadow of the resonant baritone that used to fill this room with stories of grand designs. I squeezed his fingers, trying to ground him. I pulled out the tablet from my bag, showing him the digital footprints of Aileen's fraud, the $2 million debt she had tethered to my name. I expected shock. I expected outrage. I didn't expect the tremor that took hold of his entire body. "She'll find out, Helen," he stammered, his eyes darting to the door with a raw, primal terror that made my blood run cold. "She knows everything. The tea, it makes the world soft. If I don't drink it, the world gets too loud, and then she gets angry." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Aileen hadn't just been managing his finances. She had been systematically drugging him. For 2 decades, she had used unprescribed sedatives to dull his mind, gaslighting him into believing he was suffering from early-onset dementia so he wouldn't interfere with her charity empire. He confessed, his voice breaking into a sob, that he was terrified to testify or even speak up because Aileen had convinced him he was legally incompetent. She had weaponized his own confusion, making him believe he was a burden that only her love could sustain. My anchor, the man I thought was the only stable force in this sea of lies, was effectively a prisoner of war in his own living room. I sat on the floor at his feet, the weight of total isolation crashing down on me. Have you ever realized that the person you were relying on for help was actually the one who needed saving? "Hollis, look at me," I said, my voice steady despite the tears stinging my eyes. "You aren't losing your mind. You're losing your life to a woman who doesn't know how to love anything she can't control." I held his shaking hands firmly. I thought of a truth I'd read once. You don't stand up for the truth because it's easy. You do it because the truth is the only ground that won't give way when the world starts to shake. My father couldn't find his voice yet, but I was a legal analyst. I knew how to speak for those the system tried to silence. I didn't stay long. I couldn't risk Aileen finding me there and tightening the noose around him. As I stood up to leave, I adjusted my scarf, ensuring the high-sensitivity recorder hidden in the folds was still active. I had every word of his confession. I had the tremor in his voice. I had the evidence of a crime that went far beyond money. It was a crime against a human soul. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, a silent promise that his silence wouldn't be his legacy. Walking back through the grand foyer, I felt a strange, cold peace. Mercy isn't about ignoring a crime. It's about refusing to let the criminal's darkness dictate your own light. I wasn't going to lash out in a blind rage. I was going to be the shield he couldn't be for himself. My path to justice now required me to be both the lawyer and the warrior, and I was finally ready to accept that role. The youngest daughter was gone. The protector had arrived. As I reached the heavy front doors, I saw the headlights of a car sweeping across the driveway. It was Aileen's Mercedes, sleek and black as a funeral carriage. I stepped out onto the porch just as she opened her door. The cool autumn air bit at my skin, but I didn't shiver. We locked eyes through the windshield. A silent, electric moment where the mask finally slipped. I saw the predator behind the pearls, and she saw the woman who had finally stopped being afraid. It was a silent declaration of war, and as I walked to my car, I knew there was no turning back. The chilling declaration of war lingered in the autumn air long after I drove away from Morrison Manor. My mother's gaze, sharp and calculating as a diamond, remained etched in my mind as I prepared for my final performance as a dutiful daughter. I spent the next 48 hours frozen, moving between my office and apartment with the precise rhythm of a ticking clock. Integrity is not about perfection. It is about being whole enough to stand firm beside the truth even when it is most inconvenient. The historic Richmond Hotel is a sanctuary of luxury, its polished marble floors gleaming like mirrors, seemingly mocking the dark secrets of those who walk upon them. I arrived in a flowing black silk dress, the sound of my heels clicking rhythmically and decisively on the stone. I weaved my way through a sea of people in suits and designer jewelry, a professional legal analyst dressed as an upper-class woman, my mind reviewing the final list of evidence I had gathered. Aileen was in her element, a shimmering vision in pearls and lace, holding court near the champagne tower. Beside her, Cale stood like a loyal sentinel, his chest puffed with the unearned pride of a man who thought he had already inherited the world. "Helen, you look stunning," Aileen cooed, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind my ear. Her touch was cold, a predator's caress. "I'm so glad you decided to be sensible. Tonight is a big night for the family." I offered a soft, practiced smile, thinking of the quiet power required to destroy a legacy built on the bones of a daughter's future. The ballroom was filled with Virginia's elite. The judges, the politicians, the donors who funded Eileen's bright future charity without ever looking at the ledger. They saw a saint. I saw a bookkeeper of misery. I watched them toast to her generosity, the irony of their praise tasting like copper in my mouth. A reputation built on lies is just a house of cards, and tonight, I was the breath of truth that would bring it all down. The lights dimmed for the keynote presentation. Aileen took the stage, the spotlight turning her silver hair into a halo. She began her speech, a rehearsed masterpiece of manufactured empathy about lifting up the forgotten. I stood at the back of the room, my hand hovering over the remote uplink I'd spent the afternoon configuring. The screen behind her flickered, transitioning from a heartwarming video of a soup kitchen to a high-resolution scan of a Virginia civil court summons. The silence that followed was visceral, a sudden vacuum of sound that made the air feel thin. The summons, titled Helen Morrison versus Aileen Morrison, detailed the identity theft, the forged $2 million loan, and the unauthorized surveillance. The elite of Richmond leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the digital proof of my mother's betrayal. Aileen froze, her halo slipping as she turned to see her own crimes projected 30 feet high. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered, revealing the raw, ugly desperation beneath. She stormed off the stage, her heels hammering a frantic rhythm against the hardwood. She found me in the center of the room, the cameras of the local press pivoting toward us like sharks sensing blood. "How dare you!" she hissed, her voice a jagged blade. Before I could speak, she swung her hand, a stinging slap that echoed louder than any speech. My head snapped to the side, the copper taste in my mouth becoming real. The ballroom gasped, but I didn't flinch. I didn't strike back. I simply turned my head back to her, slowly wiping a drop of blood from the corner of my lip. I looked into her eyes and felt a profound, unexpected mercy. The kind you feel for a wounded animal that doesn't know why it's being caged. She expected me to scream, to cry, to prove I was the emotional wreck she'd tried to convince the world I was. Instead, I stood my ground, my silence a more powerful weapon than her violence. I had finally stopped the monster, and in doing so, I had saved what was left of myself. "Helen, you've lost your mind!" Cale shouted, stepping forward to intervene. I ignored him, walking toward the microphone on the nearby podium. My voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and projected with the steady authority of a woman who had already walked through the fire. "This isn't an act of hate," I said to the room, my words hanging in the air like a final judgment. "It's an act of hygiene. I am simply cleaning my life of the things that no longer belong there." I turned and walked away, the sea of socialites parting from me like the Red Sea. I didn't look back at the wreckage of the gala. I didn't care about the whispers or the scandal. I felt the weight of that $2 million forgery lifting from my soul with every step I took toward the exit. In America, we are told we can reinvent ourselves, but the truth is deeper. You aren't defined by the family you came from, but by the standards you refuse to lower for them. The night air was crisp as I reached the parking lot, a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the ballroom. I felt a strange, quiet exhilaration, the kind that comes when you finally stop playing a role that was written for you by someone else. I reached into my purse for my car keys, my hand finally steady. I had brought the truth into the light, and for the first time in 28 years, I could breathe without Aileen's permission. As I approached my SUV, my phone rang with a text message. It was an anonymous message from a disposable number, probably from a guest still at the hotel. "Do you think you've won, Helen? You didn't just file a lawsuit. You just signed your own death warrant. Check your brakes." I stood in the shadows of the parking lot, the silence of the night becoming terrifying. The fight wasn't over. The predatory silence of that parking garage stayed with me, a cold weight in my chest that didn't lift even as the sun rose over the Alexandria courthouse the following morning. I spent the night in a hotel, triple-locking the door, my mind a legal switchboard connecting the dots of a betrayal that had moved beyond money. Character is not what others whisper about you in the hallways of power. It is how you hold the line when their lies are the only thing the world can see. Standing before the mahogany doors of courtroom 4B, I smoothed my suit jacket, my reflection in the brass handle showing a woman who was no longer just a daughter, but a fortress. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low, rhythmic hum of high-stakes litigation. Aileen sat at the defense table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her face a masterpiece of practiced, motherly sorrow. Cale stood behind her, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of arrogance and something that looked suspiciously like fear. The preliminary hearing began with a sharp, clinical efficiency that I found strangely comforting. It was a world of rules, and for the first time in 28 years, I was the one holding the rulebook. The first blow from Aileen's legal team was as sharp as a scalpel. They presented sealed psychiatric records, alleging that I, Helen Morrison, had been suffering from paranoid delusions and a clinical break from reality since my father's health declined. It was a calculated attempt to invalidate my testimony and portray my discovery of the tracker as a hallucination. Have you ever stood in a room full of strangers while the person who raised you tried to erase your sanity for the sake of a bank account? I didn't flinch. I let the lie hang in the air like smoke, knowing that the truth is the only flame that never chokes. But the real dagger of deceit was revealed moments later. My own legal team, acting on the files I'd harvested from the bright future servers, dropped a document onto the judge's bench that turned the room into a vacuum of sound. It was a secret life insurance policy Aileen had taken out on me just 30 days ago, a policy with a $1 million payout and a double indemnity clause for accidental death. A parent's love should be the ultimate safety net, but in Aileen's hands it had been turned into a price tag. I looked at her across the aisle, and for a split second, I saw the mask slip, replaced by the panicked calculation of a cornered animal. "Mr. Morrison, the court will take this into evidence," Judge Miller stated, his voice a gravelly judgment that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I felt a hollow ache in my ribs, not of grief, but of a final, liberating disappointment. I realized then that I wasn't fighting for her love anymore. I was fighting to survive it. I left the courthouse that evening as a light rain began to fall, the sky turning a bruised, twilight purple. The drive home on the rain-slicked I-95 felt like a gauntlet, the headlights of the evening commute blurring into long, jagged streaks of white and red. I was in the high-speed lane, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the wet asphalt usually a source of calm. But then, without warning, the world died. The dashboard lights flickered once and went pitch black. The steering wheel, usually light and responsive, suddenly felt like a solid block of lead in my hands. I pressed the accelerator. Nothing. The engine had been cut, not by a mechanical failure, but by a digital executioner. I realized in a heartbeat that the remote engine shutoff I'd discovered under my chassis wasn't just for surveillance. It was a kill switch. My pulse hammered against my throat, a frantic, primal rhythm that threatened to drown out my logic. I looked in the rearview mirror. A semi-truck was bearing down on me, its air horn a deafening scream in the dark cabin. When the system fails, you have to trust the physics. I remembered my father's engineering lessons from the garage. Momentum is your only friend when the power is gone, Helen. Use it. I didn't panic. I didn't stomp on the dead brakes. I gripped the heavy wheel with every ounce of strength I had, guiding the 2-ton dead weight toward the shoulder, weaving through the chaos like a ghost. The SUV finally came to a complete stop by the side of the gravel road, the silence that followed so heavy it felt like it was suffocating my eardrums. I sat there for a long time, the rain pouring down on the roof. They didn't just want my silence or my possessions. They wanted me gone. The GPS tracker was the restraint, the insurance policy the engine, and Cale's phone app the weapon. This was no longer just a family dispute. It was a lightning assassination. I stepped out into the cold rain, my hands trembling as the adrenaline finally began to ebb. I looked back at the highway, at the hundreds of cars oblivious to the fact that I had just survived a calculated execution. I wasn't angry. I was simply finished. Forgiving someone is a personal gift you give yourself, but allowing a predator to continue hunting is a crime against everyone they haven't reached yet. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen glowing with the contact information Agent Martinez at the FBI had given me. I wasn't calling as a daughter seeking a reconciliation. I was calling as a witness to a felony. I stood there in the Virginia twilight, the rain soaking through my suit, feeling a transcendent resolve that I had never known. Mercy, I understood now, is sometimes allowing people to face the full, unvarnished weight of their own choices. Aileen had chosen money over blood, and Cale had chosen power over a sister's life. They had built their fortress out of glass and lies, and I was done trying to keep the wind from blowing it over. My father's voice echoed in my head, a whisper in the wind. Build it strong, or don't build it at all. I reached into the center console and pulled out the hidden backup drive, the one that contained the metadata of the kill switch activation and the audio of the wine cellar plot. It was the only thing I had left of my life in Alexandria, and it was the only thing I needed to end it. I whispered into the darkness, a final message to the woman who thought she could control the very air I breathed. You taught me how to be strong, Mom. You just forgot that I'd eventually use that strength to stop you. The rain on the I-95 had washed away the last of my hesitations, leaving me with a cold, crystalline resolve that felt sharper than any blade. I didn't go back to the hotel. I drove toward the Morrison estate, parking a mile away in a dense thicket of pines where the fog acted as my silent accomplice. My mother's strength had always been her ability to control the narrative, but she had forgotten that I was the one who spent my life analyzing the subtext. Legacy isn't the wealth you leave behind. It's the truth you were brave enough to protect when the world tried to bury it. I slipped through the forgotten service entrance, a heavy iron door overgrown with ivy that hadn't been opened since my grandfather's time. My analyst's mind mapped the security blind spots with the cold efficiency of a chess player. I remembered playing hide-and-seek in these very halls, my childish laughter echoing against the limestone. Back then, the stakes were a playful tug on my pigtails. Now, the stakes were my very life and the tattered remains of my father's dignity. I moved like a shadow in my own sanctuary, hyper-focused and detached from the ghosts of the girl I used to be. The air in the lower levels was stagnant, faintly smelling of damp earth and the expensive oak of aged wine. I reached for the ventilation shaft above the private cellar, a cramped space where the Morrison family's secrets had been brewing for decades. I pulled a high-sensitivity digital tape recorder from my jacket pocket, my fingers gripping it firmly against the bars. It was a sound that altered your DNA. It was the moment you realized family was just a word, until it was challenged by greed. Down below, the heavy oak door creaked open. Aileen's voice drifted up, devoid of the honeyed warmth she used for the public, sounding instead like dry leaves skittering across a grave. The I-95 was a mess, Cale. How did she walk away from that? There was a pause, the sound of a glass being filled. Kale's response was a low, jagged growl. She's lucky, but luck runs out. The insurance company is already asking questions about the telemetry on the SUV. We need those estate papers signed by Friday, or the Apex loan sharks won't just be taking the charity. They'll be taking us. Helen is expendable, Aileen said, her voice chillingly flat, as if she were discussing the disposal of old furniture. But Hollis, his heart is weak. A slight adjustment to his nightly tea, a peaceful slip into sleep once the power of attorney is finalized, and the story writes itself. Devastated daughter, grieving widow. The public will eat it up. I felt the last shard of hope within me shatter, the sound of it echoing only in my soul. Some people aren't looking for a family to love. They are looking for a host to consume. True peace comes only when you realize you are never the problem. I recorded every syllable, every clink of the ice, every casual mention of my father's accident. My knuckles whitened around the metal of the vent. This was the smoking gun, the anatomy of a malice so deep it transcended blood. My family was no longer a unit. They were a predatory pact, and I was the obstacle in their ledger. I shifted my weight, my heart hammering a rhythmic, stoic beat against my ribs. I had been erased from their hearts long ago, but tonight, I was the one who would ensure their names were written in a federal indictment. I began my retreat, moving back through the shadows with the same ghostly precision I had used to enter. My mind was already drafting the affidavit, linking the audio to the digital trail of the kill switch. I was no longer just Helen, the youngest daughter who stayed quiet to keep the peace. I was the shield for a father who couldn't protect himself and a woman who had finally learned that self-preservation is the highest form of integrity. The darkness of the estate no longer felt threatening. It felt like a cloak of justice. Just as I stepped into the cool moonlight of the courtyard, my phone vibrated against my hip. I looked at the screen. Aileen. I took a breath, centered my voice, and answered. The transformation was instantaneous. On the other end of the line, Aileen was sobbing, a frantic, high-pitched performance of raw terror. Helen! Oh, thank God. Please. You have to come home. Men are here. They're shouting about Kale's debts. They've locked your father in the study. I'm so scared, Helen. Please, for the love of God, come help us. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a siren song designed to lure me back into the den where the enforcers were likely waiting with a pen and a threat. I listened to her weep, my eyes fixed on the distant lights of Alexandria. A year ago, I would have been halfway down the driveway before she hung up. Tonight, I simply felt a cold, cynical clarity. The most dangerous lies in the world are told in a mother's voice, but I had spent the last hour learning a different language, the language of the truth. I'm on my way, Mom, I said, my voice as steady as a mountain, as convincing as the lies she had fed me since birth. Don't do anything. Just stay with Dad. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and immediately signaled Agent Martinez through the encrypted app on my smartwatch. The GPS coordinates of the estate were already being uploaded to the FBI field office. The trap was set, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one walking into it. I was the one closing the door. I stood there for a moment longer, the cool night air, faintly scented with pine, heralding the impending change. This moment was a true liberation from all the burdens of filial guilt I had carried. I wasn't a bad daughter. I was an upright woman. I had lived my whole life under the weight of their expectations, but that burden was gone. I walked toward the car, my shadow long and confident in the Virginia moonlight, ready to face the final confrontation. Helen, you're the only one who can save us. Her voice echoed in my mind, a ghostly remnant of a lie. I whispered to the wind as I pulled onto the main road, the sirens in the distance beginning their low, rhythmic wail. I'm not coming to save you, Aileen. I'm coming to save what's left of us. The truth was the only language I spoke now, and by dawn, it would be the only thing left standing in that house. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my tires, a rhythmic, lonely sound that heralded the end of an era. I didn't turn off my headlights. They cut through the pre-dawn Virginia fog, illuminating the front of the Morrison estate like a stage set for a final, tragic act. The house was dark, but I knew the predators were awake, huddled in the study, sharpening their last desperate lies. I adjusted my smartwatch, the interface glowing softly on my wrist, confirming that the encrypted stream was live and the FBI field office was receiving every decibel of the silence. I walked through the front doors without knocking, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. The air inside was freezing, the furnace clearly ignored as the inhabitants focused on a different kind of survival. I reached the study, the heavy oak door ajar. Inside, Aileen and Kale sat behind the massive mahogany desk, a hired enforcer standing in the shadows by the bookshelves. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper, a fraudulent power of attorney document, already bearing a forged notary seal and a blank space for my signature. It was the den of my forfeiture, the place where they expected me to finally surrender my soul. "Sign it, Helen," Aileen said, her voice a jagged whisper that lacked even a hint of her former maternal polish. Her eyes were sunken, two dark pits of obsession. "The men your brother owes are not patient. If you don't sign this transfer tonight, we won't be able to stop them from visiting your father in the guest wing. He's so frail, Helen. It would be a shame if his heart finally gave out under the stress." She slid a heavy gold pen toward me, the metal clicking against the wood like a spent casing. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I stood my ground, my analyst's mind pulling apart the document with the precision of a surgeon. I began to point out the inconsistencies, the lack of a proper witness signature, the violation of Virginia Code Section 64.2-1602 regarding durable powers of attorney, and the undeniable evidence of duress. I was stalling, but I was also documenting. Courage, I understood in that moment, isn't the absence of fear. It is the realization that the truth is the only ground that won't give way when the world tries to bury you alive. "You're out of time, little sister," Kale snarled, his face contorted with a mixture of greed and panic. "Sign it, or we lose everything." He stepped toward me, his shadow looming large against the bookshelves. Aileen's mask finally disintegrated, her face twisting into a mask of raw, visceral hatred. "I will burn this entire house down with all of us inside before I let you take what I've built," she shrieked. It was the final revelation of a woman who had never looked for love, only for a host to consume. I glanced down at my watch. 20 minutes had passed. The stream was complete. I looked Aileen directly in the eyes, my expression a calm, stoic mirror to her madness. "I didn't come here to save the family business, Mom," I said, my voice echoing with a quiet, devastating power. "I came here to be the primary witness to its end." The confusion on their faces lasted only a heartbeat before the world outside erupted. The shattering of the glass mask was literal. Flashbangs detonated in the courtyard, the blinding light reflecting off the wine glasses and trophies of Aileen's manufactured life. FBI tactical teams breached the study windows and doors with a deafening rhythmic efficiency. Commands barked through the air. "Federal agents, hands in the air!" Aileen was tackled to the rug while attempting to shred the documents, her screams of "This is my house!" muffled by the floor. Kale collapsed without a fight, his arrogance evaporating as the steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, a silent island in a sea of tactical gear and blue windbreakers. The walls of my gilded cage were finally falling, not by fire or violence, but by the undeniable weight of the law. I watched the agents bag the tracker, the recorder from the wine cellar, and the forged documents. The illusion was gone. My name was no longer a shield for their crimes. It was the weapon that had finally brought them to justice. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long crimson streaks across the front lawn, I found Hollis in the guest wing. He was awake, his eyes clearer than I had seen them in weeks, the fog of the sedatives finally beginning to lift. I helped him to a waiting ambulance, his hand trembling as he gripped mine. "It's over, Dad," I whispered, pressing a folder into his hands, the irrevocable trust I had prepared to ensure his medical and financial independence for the rest of his life. He didn't need to say anything. The look of profound relief in his eyes was the only thank you I required. I shared one final look with Aileen as she was led toward a black sedan in the courtyard. I offered no insults, No bitter recriminations. I simply watched her go, a quiet acknowledgement of the bridge I had burned to illuminate my own way forward. You don't win by becoming like your enemies. You win by refusing to let them take your peace. Self-preservation isn't an act of hate. It is the highest form of love you can show to yourself. The morning air was crisp, smelling of wet grass and the promise of a quiet horizon. I walked to my car, my shadow long and steady on the gravel. As I pulled out of the driveway for the last time, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a prestigious law firm in California, confirming my start date and the lease on a new apartment overlooking the Pacific. I didn't look back at the mansion in the rearview mirror. I drove toward the light, a woman who had finally reclaimed her name and her life. The road ahead is long, and the recovery process will take years, but for the first time in my life, I feel the air I breathe is entirely mine. I turn onto the highway, the crimson sky gradually transforming into a brilliant, endless blue, heralding the true beginning of a story that will ultimately belong to me.